The rain had stopped, but the city still shimmered beneath a thin veil of silver mist. From the penthouse window, Alexander Reed looked down at Los Angeles, its lights burning like 1,000 promises he no longer believed in. Tomorrow, he would marry a woman he barely knew, not for love, not for dreams, but for a clause written in his late father's will, one that chained his freedom to a ring of gold. Somewhere far below, life kept moving, cars passing, laughter spilling from cafes, music echoing from a rooftop bar. Yet, inside that quiet apartment, time felt frozen. The suit hung ready, the vows were rehearsed, but his heart remained untouched. He told himself it was just business, another contract, another performance for the world to see. Love, after all, had only ever left him with scars. Still, a whisper stirred in the silence, soft, persistent, almost like a memory. What if tomorrow, when he said "I do," something inside him finally shifted? What if the woman standing beside him wasn't just part of a deal, but the beginning of everything he never knew he needed? And so, as the city sighed beneath the night, Alexander took one last breath as a man untouched by love before the wedding night changed everything. The ticking of the clock was the only sound in the vast office. Its rhythm steady, cold matched the pulse in Alexander Reed's temple. Outside, Los Angeles glowed under the noonday sun. Glass towers shimmered like polished mirrors, and traffic hummed below like a restless tide. Inside the 37th floor of Reed Atelier, everything was still, too still. Alexander stood by the window, sleeves rolled up, hands in his pockets. His reflection stared back tall, composed, every inch the man the world saw on magazine covers. Yet beneath the perfect tie, the immaculate suit, was a man caught between duty and something quieter, emptier. On the desk behind him lay a single sheet of paper, its bold black letters already burned into his mind. Clause 35. In order to retain executive control of Reed Atelier, Alexander James, Reed must be legally married before his 35th birthday. He was 34, 3 months away. He exhaled slowly, eyes tracing the skyline. His father's voice seemed to echo in the room, firm but weary. You can't build an empire and die alone in it, son. Alexander used to think it was just sentimentality. Now, it felt like a curse written into ink. A soft knock broke the silence. Ryan Carter, his attorney and oldest friend, stepped inside carrying a leather folder. The board's getting restless, Ryan said quietly. Victoria's already making her move. At the mention of that name, Alexander's jaw tightened. Victoria Hale, elegant, calculating. The woman who had once smiled beside his father and then nearly destroyed everything he'd built. She had waited years for this moment, watching like a hawk for the slightest crack in his control. She wants to take it all. Ryan continued. The investors are nervous. They think the Reed legacy can't survive under a bachelor CEO. Alexander let out a low, humorless laugh. So, I'm supposed to fix that with a ring. Ryan hesitated. You know your father's condition. If you don't marry before May 23rd, the controlling shares transfer to Victoria's trust. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier. Alexander turned back to the window, watching the sun slide behind a cloud. For years, he had built Reed Atelier from the ashes, rebranded it, expanded it, made it one of the most coveted fashion houses in the country. He'd fought off lawsuits, scandals, betrayals, but this was different. This wasn't about business. It was about legacy, love, and a loneliness he had no time to admit existed. Ryan's voice softened. Your father believed marriage would ground you, keep you human. Alexander smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. And yet, he turned it into a transaction. He walked to the desk, picked up the paper, and read the line again. The ink shimmered faintly under the afternoon light. Married before 35. 3 months, 90 days. The sound of the city below felt distant, like a song fading through walls. He wondered if this was how power always ended, not in triumph, but in silence, wrapped in legal bindings and empty vows. Ryan closed the folder, watching him carefully. You could still choose someone, a partnership, a private agreement. It doesn't have to be love. Alexander looked up sharply. It never is. Ryan. The words hung in the air longer than he meant them to. Outside, a low rumble of thunder rolled over the city, soft and far away. He hadn't noticed the clouds gathering. The first drops of rain hit the window, blurring the skyline into streaks of silver. He stood there for a long time, watching the rain fall. Somewhere deep down, beneath layers of discipline and duty, something flickered like the faintest tremor of a forgotten heartbeat. He remembered the last time it rained like this. The night of the funeral, the scent of roses mixed with the smell of wet asphalt. His mother's hand trembling as she placed a single white lily on the coffin. He had promised himself that day no more attachments, no more weakness. Love, in his world, came with a price too high to pay. The office door clicked shut behind Ryan. Silence returned, broken only by the storm pressing against the glass. Alexander walked to the wall of sketches pinned beside his desk, drafts of upcoming collections, colors, shapes, silhouettes. Each design reflected perfection, precision, control, everything his life was built on. And yet, staring at them, he felt nothing. He picked up a pencil and began to trace a line across the page. The line trembled slightly, just enough to betray the truth he wouldn't say aloud. Control was slipping. The thunder deepened. Lightning flashed briefly, lighting up the room in a wash of white. And in that instant, his reflection appeared again in the glass this time, not as a man in control, but as someone trapped inside his own empire. He turned away, shutting off the lights. The city glowed faintly beneath him, alive and merciless. Somewhere below, a woman walked under the rain, her coat pulled tight, her steps quick but steady. He didn't know her name, didn't see her face, but something about the way she moved through the storm, unafraid, unhurried, made him pause for just a second before he turned away. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the first ripple in a story he didn't yet know was beginning. As the rain tapped softly against the glass, Alexander Reed closed his eyes, unaware that the next decision he made would change everything, not just the company, not just his legacy, but the quiet, unguarded heart he thought he'd buried long ago. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the city washed clean, quiet, almost fragile. From his office, Alexander watched the mist drift between the glass towers of downtown Los Angeles. Below, life resumed its rhythm, horns, footsteps, the rush of people chasing something they might never catch. Inside, he stood still, his coffee long gone cold. He'd barely slept. The will, the claws, the ticking clock had all replayed in his head like a film he couldn't turn off. But what haunted him more wasn't the deadline. It was her, Victoria Hale, a name that carried a chill through the walls of Reed Atelier like a ghost refusing to leave. She had once been part of the company's heartbeat, his father's trusted business partner, his confidant. Elegant, poised, the kind of woman who could turn a boardroom with a smile. But power had always been her true language. When the market crashed 7 years ago, Victoria had seen her chance, leaked information, shifted shares, made backdoor deals that almost destroyed the family business. Alexander's father had fought to keep it alive, and the fight had taken his life. Alexander never forgot the look on his father's face the last time he saw him, tired, betrayed, but still trying to protect what he'd built. That image had become a scar, buried deep beneath tailored suits and polite smiles. Now, Victoria was back. A soft chime broke the silence, an incoming message. Alexander glanced at the screen. From the board secretary, Victoria Hale requests a meeting this afternoon. Says it's urgent. He stared at the words, a slow anger rising in his chest. Urgent? Of course. Everything with Victoria was urgent when it benefited her. At 2 o'clock, the elevator doors opened, and she stepped out like a storm in silk. Her perfume reached the room before her voice did. "Alexander," she greeted, smooth as glass, her lips curving into something between a smile and a warning. "Victoria," he replied, standing behind his desk, every line of his body composed, unreadable. She took her time crossing the room, eyes scanning the office, the art, the view, as if she were measuring how much of the empire still belonged to her in spirit. "You've done well," she said softly. "Your father would be proud." The words hit like ice. He didn't answer. She placed a file on his desk, her manicured fingers tapping once against the leather. "The board is nervous. Investors talk. They think Reed Atelier needs stability, a family face, someone to remind them of continuity." Her gaze lifted, meeting his. "Marriage looks good in business. Alexander, especially now." He almost laughed. "You mean marriage looks good for you? If I fail, you get everything my father worked for." She tilted her head slightly, the faintest glimmer of amusement in her eyes. "Business is business. You know that better than anyone." For a moment, the air between them thickened history, resentment, grief all tangled into silence. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the door. But before leaving, she paused. "Don't take too long to decide. Deadlines have a way of sneaking up on people." The door closed with a soft click. Alexander stood motionless, jaw tight, staring at the faint reflection of her figure in the glass wall. That was her gift. She never raised her voice, never showed her hand. She didn't have to. Every word she spoke was a thread, and if you weren't careful, you'd find yourself tangled in it. He pressed his palms to the desk, the wood cool beneath his skin. His father's portrait hung on the far wall, the corners slightly faded by time. For years, Alexander had carried the weight of that legacy quietly, without complaint, but now the old wound bled again. "I won't let her win," he whispered under his breath. Outside, the rain began again, soft and steady. It filled the silence, wrapping around him like a promise. Later that night, when the building had emptied and the city lights blurred against the fog, Alexander sat alone in the conference room. The skyline stretched out before him, beautiful, distant, untouchable. He ran a hand through his hair and exhaled. He thought about the irony. A man who could negotiate million-dollar contracts, outwit the press, and run a global empire yet now. His future hinged on a wedding ring, a ring he didn't want. His phone buzzed again. "Ryan, she's already gathering proxies." The message read, "You have less time than you think." He stared at the screen until the words blurred. Then, slowly, he put the phone down and leaned back in his chair. For the first time, the thought crossed his mind. What if this wasn't about protecting the company anymore? What if it was about protecting his father's name? And maybe, somehow, his own soul? He looked up. Through the glass wall, the city lights shimmered like scattered stars. Somewhere in that sea of strangers, he imagined there might still be one person untouched by ambition or deceit. Someone who could look past the empire and see the man beneath it. The idea felt absurd, almost childish. And yet, for the first time in years, it didn't feel impossible. He closed his eyes and let the sound of rain steady his breath. There, in the quiet pulse of the storm, a single thought settled deep inside him. If I have to marry, it will be on my terms. He didn't know yet what those terms were. He only knew this: he would never again let anyone, not even fate, dictate the story of his life. And somewhere beyond the glass and rain, in a corner of Brooklyn where the street smelled of coffee and rain-soaked fabric, a young designer named Clara Brooks was sketching under the dim light of her studio, unaware that her life was already being written into his. The city slept, the rain fell, and the darkness between two strangers began to hum with the faintest spark of destiny. The morning light slanted through the blinds of Alexander's office, soft but intrusive, landing across stacks of contracts that no longer seemed to matter. The city outside was already alive. But inside, time held its breath. The silence broke with the creak of the door. Ryan Carter stepped in, a familiar calm in the storm, his briefcase in hand, expression unreadable. Alexander didn't look up right away. He'd been staring at the same line in a financial report for 10 minutes, reading it without seeing it. "If you're here to talk about the board again," he murmured, "save it. I already know what they want." Ryan closed the door quietly. "Actually," he said, "I'm here with something they don't." There was a rustle behind him, the sound of hesitant footsteps, soft fabric brushing against the marble floor. Alexander's brow furrowed as he lifted his gaze. A woman stood in the doorway, clutching a worn leather portfolio against her chest. She couldn't have been more than 30. Her hair was pulled into a loose bun, a few strands escaping around her face. Her jeans were faded, her denim jacket frayed at the cuffs. Everything about her seemed to belong to a world far from polished boardrooms and gold-trimmed elevators. Ryan gestured toward her. "Alexander, this is Clara Brooks." She offered a small nod, polite but not timid. "Mr. Reed." Her voice was steady, though her fingers tightened slightly on the portfolio. Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You're a designer." "Yes," she replied, meeting his gaze. "Freelance. I worked with small labels in Brooklyn, nothing like Rita Tellier." He glanced at Ryan. "And what exactly is this?" Ryan set the briefcase on the desk. "A proposal," he said simply. "An unconventional one." Alexander arched an eyebrow. "Go on." Ryan exchanged a quick glance with Clara before speaking. "You need a marriage to secure your position. The board needs to see stability. But you don't have time or interest for the kind of relationship they expect. Clara's willing to help. Temporarily." The silence stretched. Alexander let out a quiet breath through his nose. Part disbelief, part irritation. "You're suggesting I marry a stranger?" Ryan didn't flinch. "Legally, for a year, it satisfies the will, buys you time, and keeps Victoria off your back." Clara finally spoke, her tone even but soft. "I know how it sounds, but I'm not here for the money or the publicity. I have my own reasons." Alexander turned his attention to her again. There was something in her eyes, something unguarded, resolute. It wasn't ambition, it wasn't fear either. It was honesty. "What kind of reasons?" he asked quietly. She hesitated. "My mother's health. The treatments aren't cheap. I'm doing everything I can to keep up. But I need stability. For a while." The room went still. He looked down, tapping a pen lightly against his desk. It was the first time in months that someone had stood before him without a hidden agenda. No pitch, no performance, just truth, offered plainly. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the table. "You understand this wouldn't be real," he said. "No affection, no expectations. It's a business contract, nothing more." Clara nodded. "That's the only kind I'm interested in." For a moment, neither spoke. The hum of the air conditioner filled the space between them, faint and steady. Ryan broke the silence. "I've drafted preliminary terms. You can review them and decide." Alexander picked up the folder, flipping through the first few pages. Everything was clean, precise, unemotional, but his eyes caught on one detail: the signature line at the bottom. Clara's name written neatly beside his own, waiting for ink. It felt heavier than paper should. He closed the folder slowly. "You've thought this through?" Ryan nodded. "It's the only option that doesn't put you in Victoria's pocket." Alexander stood, walking to the window. Below, traffic swirled like veins of light through the city. He could see his reflection faintly, his face half shadowed by the glare. A man of logic, calculation, control, yet standing at the edge of a decision that defied all three. He turned back, eyes on Clara. "If we do this, there will be rules," he said. "You'll stay at the penthouse. We'll make public appearances when necessary. Beyond that, you'll live your life, and I'll live mine." Clara nodded once. Understood. Her calmness unsettled him more than defiance would have. She didn't try to charm or persuade. She simply agreed, like someone who had already accepted the cost of surviving. Ryan gathered the documents. I'll have the papers ready by morning. When he left, the office fell quiet again. Clara stood by the desk, uncertain whether to go. Alexander gestured toward the sketches pinned on the wall. You design clothes, he said, almost absently. Yes. Then tell me what's wrong with this collection. He pointed at one of the drawings, a sleek evening gown draped in silver lines. Clara studied it, tilting her head. It's beautiful, she said softly. But it doesn't feel alive. It looks like it's trying too hard to impress, not to move. He blinked, caught off guard. No one in this building would have dared say that. Not to him. She turned toward him, her expression calm. Clothing isn't just fabric and form. It's a memory someone chooses to wear. He didn't reply, but something in her words lingered, faint and echoing. She stepped back, clutching her portfolio again. Thank you for your time, Mr. Reed. He nodded slightly. You'll hear from Ryan. When the door closed behind her, the silence returned, but it wasn't the same. For the first time in years, Alexander found himself looking at the sketches on the wall and wondering if she was right. If maybe, without realizing it, he'd been building beauty that had forgotten how to breathe. He turned off the lights, leaving the room in half shadow. The city glimmered outside, reflected faintly in the glass. Somewhere out there, a woman in a frayed denim jacket was walking into the night, unaware that her simple, steady presence had already left a small crack in his perfect, controlled world. And through that crack, the first hint of something unpredictable began to slip in quiet, uninvited, and impossible to ignore. The ink had barely dried on the contract when the quiet between them began to feel heavier than words. The morning sun spilled across Alexander's office, soft but uninvited, glinting off the silver pen that still rested on the table between them. The deal was done, or at least, it would be. Clara Brooks stood opposite him, her posture calm, her eyes steady. She wasn't the kind of woman who flinched under power, though the world she had just stepped into was built on it. Ryan had left the room moments earlier, leaving behind 2 copies of the agreement and an air so still it could almost hum. The scent of paper and coffee lingered. Outside, the hum of the city carried on, oblivious to the fact that, within these glass walls, 2 strangers were about to rewrite the course of each other's lives. Alexander spoke first. His voice was even, controlled, as if he were dictating a memo rather than sealing his own fate. We'll make the announcement in 2 weeks, he said. A private ceremony. No press until after. Clara nodded. Understood. He studied her face. There was no nervousness, no hint of calculation, only a quiet focus, like she was measuring every word before she spoke. You do realize what this means, don't you? He asked. Once this becomes public, the world won't see this as a business arrangement. They'll see you as my wife. Clara didn't hesitate. Then I'll act the part. He leaned back slightly, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. It's not an easy role to play. She smiled faintly, almost as if she pitied his caution. Neither is yours. For a brief moment, silence softened the edges between them. The city light caught on her hair, turning its brown strands almost golden. She didn't belong here, he could see that. And yet, somehow, she didn't seem out of place either. He signed first, his signature quick and precise. Then he handed her the pen. Her hand brushed his as she took it, just a light touch, but enough to make the air shift. She signed slowly, her name curling neatly beneath his. When she was done, she looked up at him. So, she said quietly, we have a deal. A deal, he repeated. But the words didn't feel as solid as they should have. Ryan re-entered with 2 glasses of sparkling water, breaking the moment. Congratulations, he said lightly, though his tone carried something cautious beneath it. The board will rest easier, and so will your investors. Alexander gave a curt nod. Send the documents to legal and arrange a PR schedule. We'll need to control the narrative. Ryan gathered the folders, but his gaze lingered on Clara, curiosity flickering in his expression. I'll take care of it. Then he left again, closing the door behind him. The sound of the latch echoed softly through the office. For a while, neither of them spoke. Finally, Clara moved toward the window, her steps slow, deliberate. Los Angeles stretched below them, a mosaic of sunlight, glass, and motion. She traced a fingertip along the edge of the frame. It's beautiful from up here, she said. Alexander looked at her reflection in the glass. It's easier to admire when you're not the one trying to hold it together. Her eyes met his in the reflection. Maybe that's why you need someone who's not. He didn't answer. She turned to face him fully. Let's be clear, she said softly. I'm not here to make things complicated. I know what this is. You need a wife. I need a way to help my mother. That's all. He nodded once. Good. Then we understand each other. But the truth was, he didn't understand her at all, not yet. There was something in her tone, not defiance, not detachment, but a quiet strength that unsettled him. He'd built his life around people who wanted something from him, money, power, access. But Clara, she only wanted time, and somehow that made her harder to read. He reached for his jacket. You'll move into the penthouse this weekend. Ryan will arrange transportation. She hesitated, then nodded. All right. As she turned to leave, Alexander found himself saying, Why did you agree so quickly? Clara paused at the door, hand resting on the handle. Because sometimes, she said softly, a strange choice is still better than standing still. He watched her walk away, the sound of her footsteps fading down the marble corridor. For a long while after she left, he stayed by the window, staring at the city that had given him everything and taken almost as much. The glass reflected his own face back at him, but faintly now, blurred by the bright afternoon sun. He thought about her words. A strange choice. Maybe this entire situation was exactly that. But the truth, unspoken even to himself, was that something about Clara's calm, unassuming courage had cracked open a part of him he'd buried under years of order and precision. He turned, his eyes landing on the two glasses still on the desk, hers half finished, a faint lipstick mark on the rim. He almost reached for it, then stopped. Instead, he exhaled slowly, the breath long and quiet. The contract lay between the glasses, two signatures bound together by ink and circumstance. It was supposed to be simple, temporary, clean. But as the light shifted across the office floor and the city hummed below, Alexander couldn't shake the uneasy thought that somewhere in that careful agreement, something unpredictable had already begun. And for the first time in years, he didn't know whether that frightened him or made him feel alive. The morning light spilled across the penthouse like a quiet confession. Everything about that space screamed precision polished marble floors, tall glass walls, orchids perfectly arranged by someone paid to care about details. And yet, in the middle of all that elegance, a single coffee cup sat crooked beside a laptop, half full, forgotten. Clara's coffee. She'd been up since dawn, her hair tied loosely, sleeves rolled to the elbows as she typed with focused determination. The glow from the screen reflected in her eyes, a mix of curiosity and quiet rebellion. Somewhere behind her, the city was waking up, unaware that she was about to change the story of Alexander Reed in a way he could never have planned. She opened a new account, username O Alexand Clara. Her fingers hesitated for just a second before hitting create. It felt strange claiming his name beside hers, even in pixels. But this was part of the deal. To the world. They needed to look like more than an agreement. They needed to look like love. Within an hour, she'd gathered old photos from public archives press events, charity galas, fashion shows. Alexander always looked composed, immaculate, cold. She chose one from Paris Fashion Week the year before, a photo where he'd been caught turning slightly toward the camera, a faint, almost human smile at the corner of his mouth. Clara cropped herself into the frame, adjusting lighting until it looked seamless. Her hand on his arm, their faces tilted toward each other under the Paris lights. Perfect. She uploaded it with a simple caption, Paris, where everything begins. Read Power Couple. The first notification came less than a minute later, then another, then a flood. The algorithm did the rest. Within hours, the photo was everywhere, reposted by fashion blogs, shared on fan accounts, dissected by gossip pages. Who is Clara Brooks? The mystery woman behind Alexander Reed. Reed Atelier's CEO, finally in love. By noon, the story had traveled across the industry like perfume in a crowded room. Alexander found out during a board meeting. The conference table gleamed under the soft light as Ryan slid his phone across the surface. Face unreadable. You should probably see this. Alexander frowned, glancing at the screen. His own face stared back, his arm around Clara, her smile bright, the Eiffel Tower glowing behind them. And beneath it, the headline, the power couple fashion didn't see coming. A muscle in his jaw tightened. What the hell is this? Ryan tried not to smile. It's smart. It looks real. The stock is already up 2%. He looked at the photo again. She did this. Ryan nodded. Before breakfast, apparently. Alexander exhaled slowly, the kind of sigh that sounded half like irritation, half reluctant admiration. She didn't even ask. No, Ryan said, but she didn't need to. That afternoon, he found her in the study, sitting cross-legged on the couch, a mug of tea beside her, and the same calm focus she'd had that first day in his office. She looked up when he entered, but didn't stand. Good timing, she said softly. You've gone viral. He crossed his arms. You had no right to use my image. I had every reason to, she replied evenly. This was the goal, wasn't it? To convince the world we're real, that you're not just a cold executive forced into marriage. His eyes narrowed. I didn't ask to be turned into a tabloid headline. Clara tilted her head, meeting his gaze without fear. You asked to protect your company. I'm just doing it better than you expected. The silence stretched thin between them. For a second, something like amusement flickered in his expression there, then gone. He walked toward the window, hands in his pockets. You're bold, he said finally. That can be dangerous in this world. I learned that being silent can be worse. Her voice was calm, but her words hung heavy. He turned, studying her face. She didn't flinch under his stare. The room filled with the hum of city traffic from below. Somewhere, a distant siren faded into the afternoon air. He almost smiled then, though he wouldn't admit it. Next time, run it by me. She raised an eyebrow. Next time, trust that I know what I'm doing. It was the first real clash between them, not loud, not cruel, just a quiet collision of two people used to being right. That evening, as the city lights bled into the glass, Alexander scrolled through the posts again. The image of them together filled his feed, laughing, walking, holding hands, fabrications, all of it. Yet the strangest thing was how natural it looked, the warmth in her eyes, the ease in his posture, as if the photograph had captured not what was, but what could have been. He closed the app and leaned back in his chair. The world now believed in their story, one that hadn't even started. In her room down the hall, Clara sat with her laptop open, watching the numbers climb, likes, shares, comments. Beneath the noise, though, she felt a pang she couldn't name. Maybe guilt, maybe something softer. She shut the laptop gently, letting the quiet return. The city outside glittered like it always did, distant, alive, untouchable, and somewhere, deep inside that high-rise, two people bound by ink, pride, and necessity had just taken their first step into a game neither of them understood, a game that looked like love, and maybe, just maybe, would start to feel like it too. The first time he saw her at work, really saw her. It was late afternoon, the kind of hour when sunlight bends through glass and turns everything gold. The office was quiet. Assistants had gone home. Phones stopped ringing. Even the city seemed to pause between its breaths. Alexander stood in the doorway of the design studio, watching Clara from a distance. She was leaning over a table covered in sketches, her hair tied up loosely, a pencil tucked behind one ear. The air around her felt alive, pulsing with quiet focus. He hadn't planned to come here. He was supposed to be in a meeting across town, but Ryan had mentioned that Clara was reviewing the upcoming fall collection. He told himself it was curiosity and instinct to check on how his fake wife was representing the company. But the truth was simpler and harder to admit. She intrigued him. Her movements were deliberate, yet unpretentious. She studied each design, then rearranged them, layering fabric samples on top. When she spoke to one of the junior designers, her tone was gentle, but assured. "This pattern fights the silhouette," she said, tracing a fingertip along a sketch. "It's like two songs playing in different keys. The eye doesn't know where to rest." The designer blinked, then nodded, scribbling notes. Alexander lingered by the door, unnoticed, listening. He'd built Reed Atelier on structure control, precision, presentation. But this woman, with her worn denim jacket and unpolished charm, seemed to understand something deeper. She didn't chase perfection. She sought truth. Finally, she turned and saw him. For a moment, she didn't speak, just straightened her back and met his gaze. "You're early," she said, calm as if they'd met in passing, not under the weight of 1,000 rumors. He stepped forward, his tone measured. "You didn't tell me you'd be reworking the entire line. I didn't think I needed permission to make it better." That answer should have irritated him, but it didn't. He looked at the table. Her notes, sketches, the layers of fabric she'd paired together. Unexpected, bold combinations, silk with brushed cotton, leather with lace, contradictions that somehow worked. "You're changing the aesthetic," he said quietly. Clara nodded. "I'm bringing it back to life." Her words lingered. He circled the table slowly, stopping beside her. "You really believe fashion can be alive?" She smiled faintly. "Everything we make carries breath. If we let it," he wanted to challenge her, to call it idealistic. But something in her tone made him pause. There was no arrogance in it, only conviction. The silence between them stretched uncomfortable, but not cold. He realized, with a start, that he didn't want to fill it. After a while, she returned to her sketches. "You built this brand on precision," she said, not looking up, "but precision without warmth becomes armor. It keeps people out." He felt the sting of truth in that. She looked up again, eyes meeting his. "You asked me to make the world believe in us. Maybe it starts with you believing in something too." He didn't know how to respond, so he said nothing. Just watched her as she adjusted the light over the table, her fingers brushing against fabric like it was something sacred. There was something rare about her, an ease that didn't come from confidence, but from clarity. Most people in his world performed for approval. Clara simply was. Later that evening, Alexander sat in his office, staring at the city lights that glittered like scattered diamonds. His mind replayed her words, the certainty in her voice, the calm steadiness of her gaze. He'd met hundreds of designers, brilliant, ambitious, desperate to impress, but none of them had made him question the way he saw his own creation. Until now, he found himself wondering what kind of woman carried that kind of quiet fire, and why she hid it behind modest clothes and simple smiles. The rain began outside, soft against the windows. It reminded him of the night the will had arrived, the night everything had started to unravel. But tonight, for the first time, the sound didn't feel heavy. It felt cleansing. He picked up one of Clara's revised sketches from the table beside him. A simple coat, structured but soft at the seams. It looked like something that had lived a life already familiar, comforting, human. He smiled, just barely. "Alive," he murmured under his breath. The next morning, when he entered the studio again, the team was buzzing. The new mock-ups were up, fabrics draped, models preparing for test fittings. At the center of it all, Clara was directing quietly, her presence pulling everyone into rhythm. He stood at the doorway again, unseen, and realized something that made his chest tighten just a little. For the first time in years, he wasn't just observing talent, he was witnessing passion. And for reasons he couldn't explain, it made him feel both inspired and deeply uneasy. That night, when she passed by his office to leave, she paused. "Tomorrow's lineup is ready," she said softly. "Would you like to review it?" He shook his head. "I trust you." Her eyes flickered with surprise, then something softer. "That's new." He smiled slightly. "Don't get used to it." Clara laughed quietly and turned to go. The sound lingered in the air long after the door clicked shut. Alexander leaned back, staring at the empty doorway, feeling a shift he couldn't name. In a life built on contracts, conditions, and control, this woman, unexpected and uninvited, was teaching him something dangerous. How to feel. And somewhere deep down, though he would never admit it, he knew it was only the beginning. It was almost midnight when the lights of Reed Atelier burned brighter than the moon outside. Most of the city had gone quiet, but the studio still breathed softly the hum of machines, the faint clatter of fabric rolls, the whisper of pencil on tracing paper. Alexander sat alone at the long drafting table, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, surrounded by sketches that refused to come together. His laptop glowed cold light across the plans for the new outerwear line, the one he'd promised to unveil in 6 weeks. Every line looked perfect, and somehow, it still felt wrong. He pressed his fingertips against his temple, eyes closed, as if he could will inspiration back into place. Then came a soft knock, hesitant but clear. He didn't look up. "Come in." The door opened just enough for a sliver of light from the hallway to cut across the room. Clara stepped inside, her hands wrapped around 2 paper cups. "You look like you might still be here," she said gently. "And I didn't trust you to eat dinner." He almost smiled. "Dinner's overrated. Coffee isn't—" She crossed the room, the faint scent of roasted beans following her. She set 1 cup near his laptop and looked at the sketches scattered across the table. "You've been at this for hours." "I'm close," he said quietly. "But something's off. The proportions don't flow right. The engineers swear it's perfect." Clara leaned over the drawing, studying it with the same calm focus she always carried. "May I?" He nodded. She moved closer, her sleeve brushing his arm as she bent toward the paper. "The shoulder seam," she murmured. "It's cut 1/2 inch too high. It'll throw the whole drape when it moves." He frowned. 1/2 inch. She nodded again. "Sometimes that's all it takes. You can't see it in static form, but when it's worn, everything stiffens. The jacket loses breath." Alexander looked down at the line she traced with her pencil. Small, deliberate, almost invisible. How had the entire team missed it? "Show me," he said. She picked up the pen and began to adjust the angle. He watched her hand move steady, graceful, precise. There was no hesitation, no doubt, just quiet certainty. He leaned closer, following her correction, the air between them thinning with each small movement. For a while, neither spoke. The only sound was the scratch of graphite and the occasional rustle of paper. When she finally put the pencil down, their hands brushed skin against skin, a spark so subtle it might have been nothing. But it wasn't. She froze. He did too. The contact lasted barely a second, but it lingered like the echo of something unspoken. He cleared his throat softly. "You have a good eye." "Years of trial and error," she said, her voice low. He studied her face, the faint smudge of graphite near her cheekbone, the tired softness in her eyes. She wasn't polished like the women who usually filled this world, and yet, standing here under the dim studio light, she looked more real than any of them ever had. "You could have been anywhere," he said quietly. "Why fashion?" She smiled, a slow curve that reached her eyes. "Because fabric doesn't lie. It remembers everything, the hands that made it, the moments it touched. It's honest in a way people rarely are. He nodded, and for a moment, he envied that honesty. A gentle quiet fell between them again. Outside, the rain began to patter against the windows, soft and rhythmic, the city breathing along with them. Clara moved to gather the loose sketches, careful not to disturb his order. When she turned back, he was still watching her. "Don't," she said softly. "Don't what? Look at me like that, like you're trying to figure me out." He blinked, caught off guard. "Maybe I am." "Then don't try too hard," she replied, her tone almost a whisper. "Some things lose their meaning when you take them apart." He looked down, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You think that's what I do? Take things apart? I think you build walls," she said simply. "Beautiful ones, strong ones, but still walls." The words landed gently, but they landed deep. He didn't respond. Couldn't. She turned away first, gathering her things. "You should rest," she said softly. "You can't build anything worth keeping if you never stop to breathe." When she left, the room felt colder. Alexander sat there, staring at the adjusted line on the paper, the one she'd fixed with such quiet confidence. That half-inch she'd changed it transformed everything. The proportions flowed now, clean, effortless. The jacket finally moved. He exhaled, slow and heavy, a sound that almost turned into a laugh. She had been right. Again. He leaned back, eyes tracing the rain sliding down the glass. It was strange how someone could step into his world and, without force, without trying, begin to change its rhythm. He reached for the cup she'd left on the table. The coffee had gone cold, but he took a sip anyway. It tasted bitter, strong, real. For a moment, he closed his eyes. The air still carried a trace of her perfume, faint and steady, like the echo of a song he didn't know he remembered. And somewhere deep inside, beneath layers of control and distance, something began to stir, a feeling fragile enough to be mistaken for curiosity. He told himself it was nothing, just a passing thought. But as the rain tapped quietly against the windows and the city lights shimmered in the distance, Alexander Reed knew that something had shifted. Subtly, quietly, irrevocably, a half-inch on paper, a half-second of touch, and just like that, the man who had built walls around his heart felt the first crack appear. The night had grown long, stretching past the hour when even the city seemed to lose its glow. The studio lights were dimmed, casting everything in a hushed amber tone. Outside, Los Angeles shimmered in the distance, 1,000 windows blinking like tired eyes. Inside, the only sound was the steady hum of the desk lamp and the faint rhythm of a pencil scratching against paper. Clara was still working. She sat hunched over the table, one hand resting on a roll of fabric, the other sketching small adjustments on a blueprint. Her hair had come loose from its bun, strands falling against her face. She brushed them away absent-mindedly, her movements slower now, weighed down by fatigue. Alexander stood a few feet away, leaning quietly against the doorframe. He'd finished his meetings hours ago, but he hadn't gone home. Not really. He'd drifted back to the design floor, telling himself it was to check on progress. But when he saw her still there, surrounded by half-empty coffee cups and scattered sketches, he didn't interrupt. He just watched. There was something calming about the sight. The way she worked not for recognition or power, but out of something simpler, something that seemed to come from her core. It was like watching someone breathe art into existence. He walked closer, quietly, careful not to startle her. The closer he came, the clearer the details became: the faint smudge of graphite on her wrist, the tiny wrinkle at the corner of her eye when she concentrated, the soft rise and fall of her shoulders. She yawned once, blinked, and then, almost without warning, her head dropped slightly forward. The pencil rolled out of her hand, clinking gently against the table. She'd fallen asleep. Alexander stood there for a moment, unsure what to do. The world he came from didn't have room for moments like this, unplanned, unguarded, human. Yet here it was, and he couldn't look away. He moved closer, each step careful. She was curled slightly over the table, her cheek resting on her arm, her breathing steady. A few sketches lay beneath her hand, lines still fresh. He could see the new coat pattern, the same one they'd fixed together the night before. The correction she'd suggested had worked perfectly. The design was alive now. He smiled, just a little. On the back of her chair, his dark vest hung neatly where he'd left it earlier. Without thinking, he reached for it and draped it gently across her shoulders. The fabric settled around her like a quiet promise, warm against her skin. She stirred slightly, murmured something too soft to catch, and then went still again. He stood there longer than he should have, the faint smell of coffee and paper filling the space between them. In the quiet, his thoughts drifted. He remembered the endless boardrooms, the sterile events, the faces that smiled without meaning it. Power had always been a language of masks. But Clara, she didn't speak that language. She didn't need to. Her presence alone felt like a rebellion against everything cold and calculated in his world. He caught himself staring at her again. There was a softness to her expression in sleep, a peace that he hadn't seen in years. Not since his mother, perhaps. He wondered if Clara had always carried that kind of quiet strength, or if she'd built it, piece by piece, through whatever life had demanded of her. He turned his gaze to the window. Outside, the night was stretching thin, the horizon just beginning to hint at dawn. It was strange the calm that had settled over him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd stood still without thinking about profit margins or deadlines or legacy. Tonight, none of it mattered. The empire could wait. The world could wait. Right now. All that existed was the soft sound of her breathing, the gentle fall of her hair, and the quiet space between two people who had spent too long building walls. He took a step back, unwilling to wake her. The air in the room felt different now, lighter, almost kind, as if the world had forgotten, just for a moment, who they were supposed to be. When he finally turned to leave, he paused by the doorway and looked back one last time. Clara's head had shifted slightly, her face half turned toward the window, framed by the faint light of the city. The vest he'd placed on her shoulders slipped a little, and, instinctively, he wanted to go back to fix it, to make sure she stayed warm. But he didn't. Instead, he smiled quietly to himself, an expression that felt unfamiliar on his face. There were meetings tomorrow, decisions to make, roles to play. But tonight, he allowed himself this one small moment of gentleness, the kind that never made headlines but somehow mattered more than all the rest. He walked out softly, closing the door behind him, and as the light from the hallway faded, the sound of her steady breathing followed him like a heartbeat. Down the corridor, his footsteps echoed faintly against the marble. He stopped for just a second, hand resting on the cool surface of the wall, and let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Something had changed, not in a way he could define, not yet, but he felt it in the quiet spaces, in the weight that had lifted from his chest. For the first time in a very long while, Alexander Reed didn't feel alone, and though he didn't turn back, a small part of him wished morning would never come. The applause still echoed in his ears long after the lights had dimmed. The fashion show was over, and the launch of the new collection, their collection, had been nothing short of a triumph. The audience had risen to their feet, phones held high, the cameras flashing like falling stars. For the first time in a long while, Alexander Reed felt something close to pride, not for himself, but for the woman who stood quietly at the edge of the stage, her eyes shining with relief and exhaustion. Clara had done it. She'd made his brand feel alive again. The moment that sealed it came at the end during his speech. He'd stepped up to the microphone, the crowd waiting, the teleprompter glowing in front of him. But halfway through, the words froze. The screen went black. Panic flickered just for a second, but Clara had noticed. She'd walked onto the stage as if by instinct, her expression calm, her movements effortless. She placed a reassuring hand on his arm and whispered, talk about the fabric. He did, and somehow, she guided him through the rest quiet prompts, small glances, a presence steady enough to turn disaster into something almost intimate. The audience had loved it. They thought the pause had been planned, a moment of authenticity in an industry that rarely allowed it. Now, hours later, the afterglow lingered, the staff celebrated, glasses clinking, laughter filling the air. Alexander stood by the window, looking out over the city's glittering skyline. Clara sat on a nearby couch, her shoes kicked off, her hair slightly undone, laughing with one of the junior designers. He found himself smiling at the sight. For weeks, she had been the quiet force behind everything: the late nights, the revisions, the insistence that their designs needed to feel human. And tonight, it had paid off. The critics would write about fabrics and silhouettes, but he knew the truth. What the world had seen was her spirit stitched into every seam. He lifted his glass slightly, a silent toast. But even as warmth filled the room, something else flickered beneath it, a small vibration from his phone, a new message from his assistant. It read, "You should see this." He frowned and opened the attachment. A forwarded email, his name in the subject line, and beneath it, a message from Clara's company account to an address he didn't recognize, one belonging to a small textile supplier he'd never heard of. Looking forward to receiving the next batch for the private line? Confidential as agreed. The words were short, ordinary, but to him, they glowed like warning lights. Private line, confidential. He reread it twice, 3 times, his pulse tightening. Across the room, Clara laughed again, unaware of his gaze. He tried to reason with himself. There could be an explanation. Maybe it was a side project. Maybe she'd reached out for materials. Maybe. But then came the voice that lived in the back of his mind, the one shaped by years of betrayal and power, plays and broken trust. You've seen this before. He remembered his father, his trust in Victoria Hale, the whispered phone calls, the secret meetings, the slow unraveling of everything he'd built. The night Alexander had found the documents proving she'd sold them out to their competitors. History repeats itself. His mind whispered, "You just change the name." The noise of the party blurred. His throat felt dry. He tucked the phone away and watched her through the glass reflection. Her expression, her gestures, her ease, they all looked the same. But now, every movement felt different. He left the room quietly, unnoticed. Later, in his office, the city lights reflected off the glass walls like 1,000 small truths he didn't want to face. The email still glowed on his screen, and he stared at it until the lines blurred. He'd trusted her, against his better judgment, against his instincts. He'd started to believe that maybe, just maybe, this partnership was something more than a contract. He closed the laptop, but the doubt remained, heavy and sharp, like a stone lodged in his chest. When Clara knocked on his door a few minutes later, he didn't answer. She called softly. Alex, the nickname she'd started using only when no one else was around. He stayed still. After a pause, he heard her sigh, gentle but uncertain. "You disappeared from the party. I just wanted to make sure you were okay." He waited until her footsteps faded before letting out the breath he'd been holding. He wanted to believe in her. He really did. But trust wasn't something he gave anymore, not easily, not after watching it destroy everything once before. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid catching the light as it swirled in the glass. Somewhere outside, the city kept moving, oblivious to the fracture forming inside one man's heart. He told himself he was being rational, that he'd ask her tomorrow, that it was probably nothing. But he knew that wasn't true. Because beneath the logic, beneath the caution, something deeper had taken root, a quiet, aching fear that he'd let himself care again, only to be proven a fool for it. He stood by the window, his reflection staring back at him, and whispered to the empty room, "Not again." Down the hall, Clara stopped by the door of her room, unaware of the storm she'd unknowingly set off. She smiled faintly, thinking about how the evening had gone, the look on his face during the applause, the way his guard had finally seemed to fall away. She didn't see the email he'd read, didn't know that tomorrow, everything between them would begin to crack. That night, the city slept beneath a blanket of quiet rain, and inside that glass tower, two hearts that had just begun to move toward each other drifted, once again, apart. The plane touched down in Paris beneath a sky washed pale by rain. From the window, the city looked softened, gray rooftops glistening, the Seine winding like a thread of light through the heart of it all. Alexander sat in silence, the hum of the engines fading into something gentler. He hadn't been here in years. Paris used to be a place of ambition for him, deals, launches, champagne nights. But this time felt different. He didn't come for celebration. He came to close a contract for the finest wool supplier in Europe and to quiet the noise inside him. Clara sat across the aisle, her face turned toward the window. She wore no makeup, her hair tied simply. Yet something about her presence made the narrow cabin feel less confined. She was quiet, her fingers tracing circles on the condensation forming along the glass. He wondered what she was thinking, but didn't ask. They hadn't spoken much since the night of the show. The air between them had grown cautious. When they landed, the city greeted them with the smell of rain and roasted chestnuts. The car wound through narrow streets toward the hotel near Rue Saint-Honoré, passing glowing cafes and umbrella-crowded sidewalks. The rain came and went in thin veils, the kind that makes you want to stop and breathe it in. That evening, they met the suppliers for dinner. The restaurant was all soft light and muted jazz, a glass ceiling revealing a slice of gray sky. The French executives were polite, charming, endlessly flattering. Alexander handled the business effortlessly, negotiating terms, nodding through toasts. But when one of them asked about the beautiful Mrs. Reed, Clara didn't flinch. She smiled, warm and convincing, answering with quiet grace. Her ease disarmed them all, even him. After the contracts were signed and the table cleared, they stepped outside. The rain had started again, soft and steady, turning the cobblestones into mirrors. They walked in silence, the glow from the street lamps painting their reflections onto the wet ground. Clara pulled her coat tighter around her. "You don't trust easily, do you?" she said softly. He looked at her, surprised. "That's not something I advertise. I didn't need you to." He stopped, hands in his pockets. "You think trust is something people can just decide to give." "No," she said, pausing beside him. "I think it's something people can choose not to destroy." He said nothing. The words landed deeper than he expected. They started walking again, slower now, their footsteps echoing through the quiet street. After a while, she spoke again. "When I was 8, my mother and I lived above a laundromat in Brooklyn. She worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. One winter, the heating broke, and I remember sitting by the window, wearing 2 coats, trying to draw. A man from the neighborhood, someone I barely knew, brought us a heater without saying a word. He left it by the door and walked away. I never saw him again. But that night, I learned something about kindness. It doesn't ask for attention. It just happens." She smiled faintly, the memory softening her face. "I guess I've been chasing that kind of quiet kindness ever since." They stopped near the bridge, the Seine flowing beneath them, black and silver under the streetlights. Alexander rested his hands on the cold railing. For a long time, he didn't speak. Then, quietly, he said, "When my father died, I thought it was my fault. I trusted someone who shouldn't have been trusted. Victoria Hale, she said she loved our family. She said she believed in the company, but she sold us out. My father tried to fix it, and he didn't make it. The rain fell harder now, but neither of them moved. I built walls after that," he continued, "brick by brick. I told myself love was a luxury for people who didn't understand the cost of losing it." Clara turned toward him, and now he met her eyes. The streetlight caught the drops on her lashes, the faint shimmer of water tracing her cheek. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled in his throat. Instead, He just said, "Now I'm standing in the rain with someone who's making me question all of it." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was tender, the kind of silence that carries more truth than words ever could. A soft gust of wind passed, lifting the edges of her hair. Without thinking, he reached out and tucked a strand behind her ear. His hand lingered just long enough for her to look up at him, her breath catching. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to still the rain, the lights, even the sound of the river. Then she smiled, barely. "Paris has a way of softening people," she whispered. He smiled too. Maybe. Or maybe it just reminds them what they've been missing. They stood like that for a while, two people who weren't supposed to feel anything, finding something that felt too real to name. When they finally started back toward the hotel, the rain slowed, the air turning cool and clean. The city around them was quiet, except for the sound of their footsteps and the occasional car passing through puddles. At the corner of Rue de Rivoli, she slipped slightly on the wet stones. Instinctively, his hand shot out, catching her by the waist. Their faces were too close. She laughed softly, breathless, her hand resting on his chest. "You're quicker than you look." He didn't let go immediately. "You're lighter than you seem." Something flickered in her eyes, then something neither of them dared name. He helped her steady herself, and they kept walking. But this time, they didn't keep the distance between them. Later, when she fell asleep on the flight home, her head resting lightly against the window, Alexander watched the reflection of her face in the glass. He should have looked away. He didn't. Outside, the first blush of sunrise touched the clouds, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of legacy or fear or loneliness. He just felt alive. Paris had opened a door neither of them meant to find, and neither of them knew how to close it again. The morning they landed back in Los Angeles, the sky was heavy with gray, the kind of gray that dulls the edges of everything: buildings, voices, even feelings. Alexander barely spoke on the flight. The warmth of Paris, the laughter, the rain. They all felt like dreams now, slipping through his fingers as reality crept back in. At Reed Atelier headquarters, the air carried a strange tension. Assistants moved quietly, avoiding his eyes. When he entered the glass conference room, Ryan was already there waiting, looking uneasy. "There's something you need to see," Ryan said, sliding a folder across the table. Alexander opened it. Inside were printed emails, Clara's company address, messages exchanged with an unknown contact, attachments of sketches, patterns, technical notes, his designs. He froze. "Where did this come from Victoria's office?" Ryan said carefully. "She claims Clara sent these to a supplier overseas, that they match prototypes released by one of our competitors last week." For a moment, the room went quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock. The papers blurred as his pulse quickened, his throat tightened. The old familiar burn of betrayal creeping up like smoke. He remembered his father's voice, stern, trembling with disappointment. "You trusted the wrong person. Alex." He remembered the hospital, the sterile light, the silence after the machines stopped. Now, those words echoed again, cruel and vivid. He pushed back his chair and stood. "Where is she?" Ryan hesitated. "Alexander, I don't think we're—" "Studio floor?" Alexander didn't wait. His footsteps hit the marble in sharp, steady beats. The closer he got, the heavier the air felt. He found Clara at her desk, surrounded by fabrics and sketches, humming softly to herself. She looked up when he entered. Her face lit up. "Hey, you're back early." He didn't answer. He dropped the folder on the table between them. The pages fanned out, the incriminating words staring up like small, venomous truths. Her smile faded. "What is this?" "You tell me." His voice was calm, but too calm. The kind of calm that comes before a storm. She glanced down, scanning the papers. When she looked up, confusion clouded her eyes. "These aren't mine. They're from your email. Clara. I know what they look like, but I didn't." "Don't," he said sharply. "Don't lie to me." Her breath caught. Alexander. You think I don't recognize the pattern? My father trusted someone once too. Someone who smiled, who said the right things, who pretended to care, and she destroyed everything he built. This isn't the same, she said softly. Isn't it? His voice cracked just slightly. Because right now, it feels exactly the same. She stepped closer. You think I'd ever use you after everything we've... He turned away, unable to look at her. I don't know what to think anymore. Silence hung between them, thick, unbearable. She stared at his back, her voice trembling. You told me once that fabric doesn't lie, that it remembers the hands that made it. Do you really think my hands could do this to you? He didn't answer. Her eyes filled, but she didn't let the tears fall. If you've already decided who I am, there's nothing I can say that will change it, then don't say anything, he murmured, still facing the window. A quiet sound escaped her, half a breath, half a sob. She gathered her things with shaking hands. I believed in you, she whispered, even when you didn't believe in yourself. When she turned to leave, he finally looked at her. For a second, he almost reached out, almost stopped her, but the fear in his chest, the old wound of his father's betrayal, pulled him back. The door closed softly behind her, and with that sound, the click of the latch, the silence that followed something inside him fractured. He sank into the chair, staring at the scattered papers. None of them felt real anymore. Ryan entered quietly a few minutes later, holding a tablet. I looked deeper into the files. He said, the metadata's strange. The timestamps don't match. It's possible they were fabricated. Alexander didn't respond. Alex, Ryan said gently, what if she's telling the truth? He finally lifted his eyes, hollow and tired. Then I just made the biggest mistake of my life. Outside, the rain had begun again, tapping softly against the windows. The same sound that once calmed him now felt unbearable. He thought of Paris, the bridge, the river, the way she'd smiled when he said the city softens people. He thought of the warmth in her eyes, the way she'd listened, really listened, when he spoke of his father. And he thought of the look on her face when he accused her, the disbelief, the hurt that cut deeper than anger ever could. He pressed his palms to his eyes, his breath shaking. What have I done downstairs? Clara walked out into the rain without an umbrella, her suitcase rolling behind her. The city around her blurred lights, noise, everything melting into gray. She didn't look back. Inside the tower of glass and steel, Alexander sat alone, surrounded by silence and ghosts. For years, he had told himself that love was a weakness, that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Now, as the rain poured harder, he realized the cruelest truth of all: he hadn't been protecting himself. He'd been imprisoning his own heart, and in doing so, he had just lost the only person who ever saw beyond the walls. He didn't chase her. He just sat there, letting the storm outside mirror the one he'd created within. And somewhere deep in that silence, Alexander Reed understood some mistakes can't be undone, only lived with. The days after Clara left were slow and colorless. The studio lights felt dimmer, the walls too quiet, every sound too sharp. Alexander buried himself in work, but even that offered no refuge. He could still smell her perfume faintly on the jacket she'd once borrowed, could still hear the echo of her voice, soft, steady, certain. It haunted him in the hours before dawn, when the city outside was silent and his regrets were loudest. Then, one morning, Ryan came in with a flash drive and a look that could only mean trouble or truth. You need to see this? He said quietly. Alexander didn't move. If it's more damage control, handle it. It's not, Ryan replied. It's proof. Those words made Alexander look up. Ryan placed the drive on the desk. I found the hacker Victoria used. She paid him to fabricate the emails, timestamps, metadata, even the internal headers. They were all altered. Clara never sent them. For a long moment, Alexander didn't speak. His breath stilled. His heart didn't seem to know whether to break or start beating again. Are you sure? Positive? And that's not all. Ryan opened his laptop, turning the screen toward him. She's been moving company funds into a private account under a dummy corporation. The transfers line up with the dates she pushed the fake accusations. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air sharp in his lungs. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. God, he whispered, what have I done? Ryan hesitated. You can still fix this. Alex, there's a board meeting in 2 hours. Go public. Expose her. He nodded slowly. His eyes, when he lifted them, were colder than they'd been in years, but beneath that coldness, something else stirred, not anger, not vengeance, something like clarity. 2 hours later, the board meeting began. The conference room gleamed with glass and steel, the skyline of Los Angeles stretching behind them like a silent jury. The shareholders' faces appeared on screens from New York, London, and Tokyo. Victoria sat at the far end of the table, immaculate as always, her red lipstick precise, her smile faint but sharp. Alexander started the call calmly, his voice steady. Before we begin, I'd like to address a matter of integrity. It concerns accusations made against a former employee, Ms. Clara Brooks. Victoria's eyes flickered, but her smile stayed. Alexander, must we revisit that? The evidence was quite clear. He met her gaze. Yes, he said softly. It was too clear. He clicked a key, and the projector came to life. Screens lit up around the room with data, digital trails, bank records. These, he said, are the original files unmodified. The fake ones you distributed to the board were created by a hacker you paid, under an alias connected to your shell company, Hale Consulting. I have the invoices and the transfer receipts. A murmur spread across the board. Victoria's smile cracked, only slightly. That's a serious accusation, she said. It's not an accusation, he replied. It's the truth. He hit another key. This time, an audio clip filled the speakers. A man's voice nervous, stammering, confessing that he'd been hired to fabricate internal emails for Reed Atelier. And then, faintly, her voice, calm, controlled, instructing him to make sure the fake trail pointed to Clara. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Victoria rose, her expression stiffening. This is absurd. You have no idea who you're dealing with. But she didn't finish, because just then, the conference doors opened and Clara walked in. She looked tired but composed, her hair pulled back, her hands clutching a small folder. The room went still. Even Alexander couldn't move for a moment. It felt like seeing something you thought you'd lost forever, and realizing it had never really left. Victoria's voice faltered. You don't belong here. Clara ignored her and walked to the table. Her voice was calm, clear. Actually, I do. Because you didn't just frame me. You used the company's resources to do it. She laid a USB drive on the table. This is a recording from your assistant's phone. It includes your conversation about the offshore payments, along with proof of the money transfers here. She handed the folder to Ryan, who opened it and began projecting the contents. Numbers, signatures, transfers all leading back to Victoria. Around the room, the board members murmured again, louder this time. One of them, an older man with a silver tie, turned toward her. Is this true, Ms. Hale? Victoria's face paled. You can't prove, Ryan interrupted quietly. We already did. For a moment, she looked at Alexander, and in that fleeting glance, he saw something that might have been fear or fury. You think you've won, she hissed, but this company will devour you, just like it did your father. He didn't flinch. The difference, he said softly, is that this time, I won't let the wrong person sit at the table. Security entered quietly, escorting her out. The door closed behind her with a sharp, final sound. The meeting ended in silence. The board voted unanimously to remove Victoria Hale from all positions. Ryan confirmed the transfer of authority. And through it all, Alexander said nothing. He just sat there, eyes lowered, as the weight of everything he'd broken and everything he'd nearly lost pressed down on him. When the room finally emptied, he turned toward Clara. She stood near the window, the morning light catching her face. For a long time, he couldn't speak. Words felt too small. "You didn't have to come," he said quietly. She met his eyes, her voice soft. "Yes, I did. Not for you. For the truth." He nodded, his throat tight. "I was wrong. Clara, about everything." She looked at him for a long moment, then said simply, "I know." He took a step closer, hesitant. "I don't know how to fix what I broke." "Some things," she said, her gaze steady, "aren't meant to be fixed. They're meant to be understood." Her words lingered in the air, gentle and painful all at once. Outside, the city began to wake, the sunlight breaking through clouds, washing the glass in gold. As she turned to leave, he wanted to stop her, to say something that would erase the hurt, to ask her to stay, but he didn't. He just watched her walk away, her reflection fading in the glass until it became one with the light. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Reed didn't feel powerful, or proud, or right. He just felt human, and that, somehow, was the beginning of redemption. The first leaves of autumn had begun to fall over Central Park, scattering gold across the pathways. The air was cool, quiet, and full of that bittersweet stillness that comes before change. Alexander walked slowly beneath the canopy of trees, his footsteps barely stirring the silence. The city roared faintly in the distance, but here it was just the wind, the rustle of leaves, and the sound of his heart, heavy but certain. He carried nothing with him except a single sketch creased, worn at the edges. Clara's. He'd found it tucked between the pages of one of her old notebooks that had been left behind at the studio, a woman's silhouette drawn in a few soft strokes, surrounded by light. She had titled it Grace. He had spent weeks trying to find her, calls unanswered, messages left with friends, silence on every front, until Ryan mentioned, quietly, that she used to go to Central Park on Sunday evenings, to sit by the lake and draw. That's where she found calm, he said. That's where she thought best. And so he came. When he saw her, she was sitting on a weathered bench near the water, her sketchbook open, her pencil moving slowly, rhythmically. Her hair was tied back, but a few strands had fallen free, brushed gently by the breeze. The setting sun caught the side of her face, and for a moment, he didn't breathe. She looked peaceful, too peaceful for someone who'd been hurt by him. He stood there for a long moment, watching her from a distance, unsure how to begin. Every apology he'd rehearsed on the drive here suddenly felt small. Words weren't enough for the kind of wrong he'd done. Finally, he walked closer. The gravel crunched under his shoes. She looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly as she recognized him. The air between them shifted, like the world itself had drawn in a breath. "Alexander," she said softly, no anger, no warmth, just quiet acknowledgement. He stopped a few feet away. "Clara." Neither spoke for a moment. The sounds of the park filled the silence, the faint laughter of children in the distance, a dog barking, the gentle lap of water against the stones. He swallowed, his voice low. "You look, well." She gave a small, polite smile. "I'm fine." He nodded, his throat tightening. "I wanted to see you. I know." He hesitated, his hand tightening around the paper he held. "I came to tell you I was wrong. About everything. About you." She closed her sketchbook slowly, setting it aside. "You already said that." "I know," he said again, his voice breaking slightly. "But I need you to hear it from the man I am now, not the one I was then." He stepped closer, careful, like approaching something fragile. "When I accused you, I thought I was protecting the company, protecting myself. But all I was doing was repeating a mistake I swore I'd never make again, choosing fear over faith. My father's ghost made me blind, Clara, and I took it out on the only person who ever showed me real trust." Her eyes softened, but she said nothing. "I should have listened," he continued quietly. "I should have seen you." The wind stirred, carrying the scent of rain. He held out the sketch, the one titled Grace. "You left this behind? I think you were trying to teach me something with it." She looked at it, then back at him. "Maybe I was trying to remind myself." He smiled faintly. "About what that grace doesn't come from being right," she said softly. "It comes from forgiving what was wrong." Her words landed like a whisper against his heart. He took a step closer, then another, until he was standing right in front of her. "Clara," he said, his voice low, trembling, "I don't deserve your forgiveness. But if there's any part of you that still believes in second chances—" He paused, exhaling shakily. Then, slowly, he dropped to one knee on the path before her. The movement startled her, not grand or theatrical, but raw and unguarded. He reached for her hand. His touch was gentle, unsure. "I love you," he said simply. "Not as a headline, not as a contract, not as an idea I'm trying to control. I love you because you saw the parts of me I was too afraid to face. And I can't go another day pretending that I can build anything, this company, this life, without you in it." Her hand trembled in his. "You think love fixes everything?" she whispered. "No," he said, "but I think it gives us the courage to try again." She looked at him for a long time. The sky behind them had turned gold and violet, the last light of day stretching across the lake. Her fingers tightened around his. "You hurt me," she said quietly. "I know. And you broke something I didn't think could break. I'll spend the rest of my life making it right," he said. Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes, but she didn't look away. "You really mean that I've never meant anything more?" For a moment, all he could hear was her breathing the soft, uneven rhythm of someone deciding whether to let hope in again. Then, finally, she exhaled. "Get up." "Alexander," she said gently, "you don't have to kneel." He stood slowly, his hand still holding hers. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then, after a long silence, she said, "You can start by walking with me." He nodded, unable to speak, his chest aching with relief and fear and gratitude all at once. They walked side by side along the path, the leaves crunching beneath their steps. Neither spoke much. They didn't need to. As the last light faded over Central Park, a breeze rippled across the water, carrying with it the scent of something new, like the world itself had forgiven them a little. And for the first time, in what felt like forever, Alexander Reed let himself believe that love, when it finally came back, wasn't a weakness at all. It was grace. The air in Central Park had grown cooler as the evening deepened, the sky turning shades of rose and violet before slipping quietly toward dusk. The city hummed in the distance low, steady, indifferent, but here beneath the trees, the world seemed to slow down. Alexander and Clara walked without words, their steps soft against the path, their joined hands carrying a silence that felt more tender than speech. He could still feel the warmth of her fingers in his. Every so often, she would glance at him, almost as if she were memorizing the way he looked in this light. There was a gentleness to her gaze that stirred something deep in him, something both comforting and unfamiliar. They stopped near the bridge overlooking the lake. The water caught the fading sunlight like liquid gold. A family of ducks glided by, their ripples widening across the reflection. Clara leaned against the railing, her voice quiet. "You know," she said, "there's something I've never told you." He turned to her, curious. "What is it?" She hesitated, eyes on the water. "It's about before all this. Before Reed Atelier. Before you." He tilted his head slightly. "Go on." Her voice softened, trembling at the edges. "When I was little, my mom worked for your father's company. She was a seamstress, long hours, small pay, but she loved it. She said Reed Atelier was a place built by dreamers, people who made beauty with their hands. He felt something shift inside him. Your mother worked for my father." She nodded, For a few years, until the fire. The word landed like a quiet echo. The fire, he repeated, almost to himself. The one at the old downtown factory? Yes. Her gaze lifted slowly to his. We lived nearby. I was 6. She paused, the memory flickering across her face. That night, I remember waking up to smoke. My mom ran me outside, but she went back in. She thought one of the other workers was trapped. She didn't make it out right away. Clara's breath hitched softly, and then someone ran in after her. He stared at her, his pulse tightening. Someone. Her eyes shimmered under the last light of day. You. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. The park around them fell away, the city noise, the wind, even the sound of the water. Only her words remained. You were just a boy, she continued, her voice trembling between grief and gratitude. Your father brought you to see the workers that week. You saw the fire before anyone else. I remember you running toward it while everyone was shouting for you to stop. You pulled my mom out, and then you carried me to the curb. You had this cut on your arm. She said you didn't even notice it. His hand unconsciously brushed his forearm, tracing the faint scar hidden beneath his sleeve. He hadn't thought about it in years. She never forgot that night, Clara whispered. Neither did I. She said we owed everything to the boy who risked everything for strangers. He stepped closer, his voice low, unsteady. You were that little girl. She nodded, tears glinting softly in her eyes. I was the girl with soot on her face and a broken shoe. You gave me your handkerchief to stop me from crying. A sound escaped him, half a laugh, half a breath of disbelief. I remember that handkerchief. My father was furious that I'd run in. But he said sometimes doing the right thing hurts, and you have to do it anyway. She smiled faintly through her tears. He was right. He reached for her hand again, his own trembling slightly. Clara, all this time, I thought fate brought you into my life because of my father's will. But it wasn't the will. It was something much older. Maybe, she said softly, maybe the universe was just finishing what it started that night. They stood there in silence, the weight of years and coincidence settling gently between them. The evening breeze stirred her hair, brushing it across his cheek. He didn't move away. He looked at her, the woman she'd become, the strength in her eyes, the quiet grace that had guided him out of the shadows he'd built around himself. And suddenly, all the distance, all the walls, all the pain felt small in the face of what was standing right before him. Do you believe in destiny? He asked quietly. She smiled, her voice barely above a whisper. I believe in choices that lead us back to the people we were meant to find. He felt a lump rise in his throat. Then I choose you, he said simply. Again, always. She squeezed his hand, her eyes shining. And I choose to forgive you. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the words wash through him like light. The sun had dipped below the trees now, leaving only the soft glow of street lamps painting their faces in gold. The park had grown quieter, the air cool and still. A gentle calm settled over them, the kind that comes only when the truth finally steps out of hiding. He turned to her, his voice soft. You know, I think my father would have liked you. Clara laughed, a sound both tender and bittersweet. I think he already does. The wind rustled the leaves above them, scattering a few down like blessings. She leaned into him, her head resting lightly against his chest, his arms wrapped around her, holding her as if to anchor the moment in time. And in that quiet, beneath the fading glow of a city that never truly slept, Alexander realized something he'd never said out loud, not even to himself. Some love stories aren't written by chance or desire. They're written by the echoes of kindness we leave behind. And sometimes, if we're lucky, those echoes find their way back home. The morning of the wedding arrived quietly gray skies, soft mist, and a kind of stillness that felt like the world was holding its breath. Central Park shimmered under a fine drizzle, the grass dark with rain, the air scented with earth and roses. The ceremony was small, just a handful of friends, Ryan, a few colleagues, and the city beyond, watching from behind a veil of fog. Alexander stood under the arbor draped in white fabric, his suit dark against the pale blooms, his hands steady, but his heart not. He looked up at the clouds, half smiling. It figured, he thought, rain on the day he'd chosen to marry the woman who had turned his storms into something sacred. When Clara appeared at the edge of the garden path, the world seemed to hush. Her dress was simple soft lace that moved like water, a red rose pinned in her hair. She didn't wear a veil. She didn't need to. The light that followed her was enough. Every step she took felt like a memory of Paris, of laughter shared under an awning, of nights spent fixing broken dreams at the office, of tears and apologies that had somehow become forgiveness. She smiled when she reached him, her eyes bright, her fingers cool in his as he took her hand. "You're late," he whispered. She smiled back. "You're early." The officiant cleared his throat softly, and the ceremony began. No grand speeches, no lavish gestures, just words honest, quiet words that seemed to carry the weight of every moment they had survived to reach this one. "I, Alexander Reed," he said, voice low but sure, "promise to love you, not because I need you, but because I choose you, every day, even on the days when it rains." She looked up at him, eyes glistening. "And I, Clara Brooks, promise to stand beside you, not as your shadow, not as your cure, but as the one who reminds you you're human." The rain began to fall harder, then thin silver threads weaving through the air. Guests raised umbrellas, but Clara just laughed softly and tilted her face toward the sky. Her laughter broke something in him, something heavy and long-kept. He reached up and brushed the raindrops from her cheeks, though he wasn't sure anymore if it was rain or tears. "Do you mind?" he asked. She shook her head, smiling. "No, I think the rain came to bless us." When they kissed, the wind lifted around them. Applause broke out, soft and joyful, and Ryan's voice rose over the sound of rain. "Finally," he said, laughing. They turned, still holding hands, still caught in that fragile, unreal moment. The guests began to move toward the tent, where the small reception waited. But Alexander stopped her for a second, pulling her closer under the archway of flowers. "You know," he murmured, "I used to hate the rain." "Why?" she asked gently. "Because it reminded me of loss, of endings." She brushed a drop from his jaw with her thumb. "Maybe now it can remind you of beginnings." He smiled faintly, looking at her. "It already does." They walked together down the narrow stone path, shoes soaking, laughter mingling with the rhythm of rain. Someone played soft jazz from a speaker under the tent, something old, smooth, and kind, the kind of song that sounded like memory. Clara slipped off her heels halfway there, carrying them in one hand, her toes pressing into the wet grass. Alexander chuckled, watching her. "You'll catch a cold," he said. She looked back at him, teasing. "Then you'll just have to take care of me." He grinned, shaking his head. "Always." When they reached the tent, Ryan handed them each a glass of champagne. "To the most improbable love story I've ever witnessed," he said, raising his glass. "May you both never get tired of proving each other wrong." Clara laughed. "Cheers to that." They clinked glasses, but Alexander didn't drink. He just looked at her, at the woman who had once walked into his office with denim and defiance, and somehow taught him what love really meant. For a moment, the whole world felt suspended between raindrops. The rain softened again, falling like a whisper. Someone started a slow song, and Clara turned to him, holding out her hand. "Dance with me." He smiled, here in the rain, especially in the rain, and so they did. No audience, no spotlight, just two figures moving gently beneath the drizzle, their steps small and close. The hem of her dress darkened with water. His suit clung to his shoulders, but neither cared. The music was faint. The city lights blurred behind the mist. When the song ended, she rested her head against his chest, and he closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of rain and roses. "I used to think my father's will was a curse," he whispered, "that it forced me into something I didn't want." She lifted her head slightly, and now he smiled, his voice barely audible. "Now I think it was his way of leading me home." The rain slowed to a drizzle, then to silence. Somewhere in the trees, a bird began to sing a soft, clear note breaking through the quiet. Clara looked up, her eyes shining. The rain stopped, she said. He nodded, still holding her. "No," he murmured. "It just changed form." She smiled, not asking what he meant, because she already knew. Love, after all, was just like the rain. Sometimes it storms, sometimes it heals, but it always leaves the world a little cleaner. And as the clouds drifted apart, letting the first hint of sunlight spill over the garden, Alexander Reed kissed his wife again, under the sky that had once watched them fall apart, and now blessed them as they began again. The city of Los Angeles shimmered that night, a sea of gold and glass stretching endlessly beneath the quiet sky. From the rooftop of the Reed and Brooks Atelier headquarters, the air felt lighter somehow, like the whole world had exhaled after a long storm. Lanterns swayed gently in the breeze, the soft hum of conversation mixing with jazz and laughter. It wasn't just a celebration of a brand, it was a celebration of rebirth. A year had passed since that rainy afternoon in Central Park. A year since vows whispered through raindrops turned into something deeper, an unspoken promise that two wounded hearts could learn to heal together. Now, under strings of soft white lights, Clara stood beside Alexander, her gown a whisper of ivory silk, her smile calm and sure. Around them, guests mingled, glasses clinking, laughter rising and fading like waves. Yet somehow, amid it all, time seemed to slow when their eyes met. The Reed and Brooks Atelier had become more than a company. It had become a movement. Their designs carried messages of renewal, fabrics repurposed from discarded materials, silhouettes inspired by nature, by imperfection, by the human touch. The industry that once celebrated excess now looked to them as pioneers of something quieter, more meaningful. Alexander had changed too. The man who once measured success in profit margins now found peace in the rhythm of creation, the sound of sewing machines in motion, the way light fell across Clara's sketches, the laughter of young designers finding their voices. At one corner of the rooftop, Ryan was talking animatedly to a group of interns, retelling stories from their early chaos. "He used to bark orders like a general," Ryan said with a grin, nodding toward Alexander. "Now he brings coffee to the interns." Can you imagine? Clara laughed softly when she overheard. "They love him," she said. Alexander smiled. "They love you more. Maybe," she teased, "but they fear you less." He chuckled, glancing out at the skyline. The city lights reflected in his eyes like 1,000 tiny suns. "Do you remember the first time we stood in this building? I do," she said. "It felt colder. Because I was," he admitted. She reached for his hand. And now he looked down at their joined fingers. "Now it feels like home." The wind carried the faint scent of jasmine from the rooftop garden. For a while, they stood in silence, just breathing, the world below moving at its own unstoppable pace. Inside the glass hall behind them, a large screen played clips from their newest collection models, walking slowly down a runway made to look like a field of golden grass. The campaign slogan appeared at the end, "Created with care, worn with purpose." Clara watched, eyes glistening. "Do you ever think your father would be proud?" Alexander's voice was quiet. "I think he'd finally rest." She smiled. "So would my mother." He turned toward her then, his hand finding her cheek, thumb brushing lightly along her skin. "You know," he murmured, "I used to think legacy was about building something that lasts forever." And now she asked, "Now I think it's about building something that matters while it lasts." She leaned into his touch, eyes soft. "Then you've done it. Alexander." He shook his head gently. We have. The music shifted, a soft piano melody that felt like the closing of a story. He drew her close, one arm around her waist. They moved slowly, swaying beneath the stars. The rain had threatened earlier that day, but never came. Still, the air carried the same sweetness as that wedding afternoon, a memory that lingered between every breath. When the last note faded, he bent close to her ear, his voice a whisper only she could hear. I can't promise you the whole world, he said, but I promise you all of mine. Clara smiled, her words barely a breath. And I'll live in it forever. They stayed like that for a moment still, quiet, the city alive around them but far away. A light drizzle began to fall then, as if the heavens couldn't resist keeping their old promise. Guests rushed to find cover, laughing, lifting glasses toward the sky. But Alexander and Clara didn't move. They stood beneath the rain, eyes closed, letting the cool drops find them. The red rose in her hair darkened, its petals glistening. He reached up and tucked it behind her ear again, the way he had in Paris that first night. Still your favorite flower? He asked softly. Always, she whispered. And then, with the world shimmering around them, she pressed her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm beneath the one that had once been restless and guarded, now calm and sure. The rooftop lights blurred through the rain. The music returned, gentle and distant. Somewhere below, the city kept moving, unaware that, in this quiet space above it, two people had found something far rarer than success. They had found peace. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the lights dimmed, Alexander walked with Clara to the edge of the rooftop. The view stretched endlessly, streets like silver veins, buildings glowing like lanterns. He took a deep breath. Do you hear that? What she asked. The city, he said. It used to sound like noise to me. Now it sounds like life. She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. Maybe that's because you finally stopped fighting it. He nodded, maybe. A long, quiet pause. Then she said, Do you think stories ever really end? He looked out into the night, the rain easing into mist. No, he said softly. I think they just find a gentler place to rest. And with that, he wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. The rain slowed, the sky cleared, and above them, the first stars began to appear, faint at first, then brighter, as if the universe itself was opening its eyes. Down below, the sign on the building glowed softly through the mist, Reed and Brooks Atelier, crafted with heart. And in that moment, with the scent of rain in the air and her hand warm in his, Alexander Reed finally understood happiness wasn't something to chase or own. It was something to share, to build, and to let live. The night settled around them like a gentle promise, and somewhere in the soft hum of the city, the story that began with a loveless marriage found its quiet, everlasting home. Sometimes, life brings two people together, not through perfection, but through brokenness. Alexander and Clara's story reminds us that love isn't about grand gestures or flawless timing. It's about patience, trust, and the quiet courage to begin again after pain. Many of us spend years guarding our hearts, thinking protection means strength, but true strength often comes from vulnerability, from allowing someone to see who we really are. Their journey also shows that healing doesn't erase the past, it transforms it. The same memories that once caused pain can become the soil where forgiveness and understanding grow. When we choose kindness over pride, when we forgive instead of retreating, we build bridges not only toward others, but also toward our own peace. In the end, love is not a prize to win, but a promise to nurture. It's found in everyday grace, in a gentle word, a hand that stays, a heart that learns to trust again. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all, even in a world of ambition and noise. The truest success is finding someone who reminds you that home isn't a place, it's a feeling. Thank you, dear friends, for spending your time with Shining Stories. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the quiet power of love, forgiveness, and second chances, please give it a like. Share it with someone who needs a little light today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you heartfelt stories that warm the soul and remind us all that it's never too late to heal, to love, and to begin again.